work will continue. I don't want to come here and just be kind of a placeholder. I want to come up here on Sundays and open up the Word of God. But here's my promise to you. I'm not going to say any weird and wild and crazy things so that Rob gets back. He has to put out some fires. I'm not going to make suggestions that aren't in the Bible and things that are contrary to His Word that will disrupt His time of coming back in here. And I've said this everywhere we've went, that if I say something, if something doesn't seem quite right, come and ask me about it. I use very little notes. Most of what I speak, I just do from my head, and I try to remember most of it in my head. And there have been times where the total opposite of what I was hoping would come out of my mouth came out of my mouth. And so that is what I want to share with you. If you have a question, if I've said something, come and see me, come and ask me. I love that, and I value that. And so the message this morning, I want to kind of break into two different parts. First of all, I want to introduce our family, and give you a little bit of a background of who we are, what we're all about, how God has led us into this call of ministry. And then I want to talk for a few minutes about what that means, what that looks like. And so I'm going to put a picture up of our family up on the PowerPoint there. You can see us there. That is the latest one. That was from earlier this month. So this is the newest one for our family. And starting from your right, that's Ben. He's our oldest. He's 24, and he's here this morning. He has graduated from Prairie College with a Bachelor of Arts in Youth Ministry, and we're just waiting to see what God has in store for him next. Beside him is Samuel, and he's here this morning as well. He spent 7 months this year in Germany at a Bible college, and he's been back for a few months. And then in the fall, he's going to the U of A and taking art and design with a minor in German and literature. And so we're excited for where that goes. Two over, that's Rebecca. She's here this morning. She's the one who just graduated, our last child to graduate from high school. And she's deciding what she's going to do in the coming years. And we're excited to see where God leads her as well. And then we'll skip me there. That's Nathan. He is our second oldest. And Nathan lives in Camrose. He's entering his third year at Augustana University. And then beside him is his girlfriend, Nicole, and they've been dating for over a year now, I guess, and I'm sure they'll probably pop in here maybe once or twice over the summer as well. And then Sandra there, and myself. And we met, as most people meet, we met at a youth event in grade 7. How many of you met your spouse at a youth event? A few of you. I see a couple hands. Now, when Sandra and I met in grade 7, we didn't immediately hit it off. We didn't really have a connection. And I always say that's probably for the best. That's probably a good thing. Because if we had had that spark in junior high, we probably wouldn't be here together as a family today. But near the end of grade 12, we had kind of been going back and forth and talking to one another. And Sandra liked me. I kind of liked her. But I was really, really shy. I'm going to mention this today, I'm an extreme introvert at time. But when God calls you, He changes you and He equips you, is what we're going to be talking about. And I was never going to go and talk to Sandra, and she was very much more in your face and, hey, hello, how are you doing, and wanting to get to know me. And we started dating in May of 1992, right at the beginning of May. Well, the youth group had this little side bet going that we were only dating each other because we were looking for grad dates. And so I like to tell people that we never really ever fell in love, but we're really stubborn and don't like to lose a bet. And so here we are, over 30 years later, we're still together. But we started dating in 92, we were married in 1995. And around 1995, I began to tell Sandra something every summer. Around this time of year, I would say to Sandra, you know what, I think that God is calling me to go back to Bible college and maybe calling me to ministry. And I'd go back and forth about it, and I'd talk a little bit about it, and I wouldn't do anything else about it at all beyond that. And I would have this emotional relief every mid-September as school started up again. I'm like, okay, I dodged the call this year for another year. Well, we were married. We had one child, another child on the way. And that summer, I said to Sandra, I said, you know what? I think God is calling me to go back to Bible college and become a pastor. And she looked me right in the eye and she said, well, if you choose to do that, I will support you every step of the way. But she goes, this is the last year you get to say that. So either do it this year or just admit that you're not going to follow God's lead and don't mention it again. And so I quit my job. I went to Bible college, and the rest is history. But when I had started I went to North American Baptist College. Taylor College is what it turned into. It was no longer running. But one of my first weeks there, I saw on the bulletin board a notice for Ponoka First Baptist Church. And it said that they were looking for a part-time youth worker. And it's the only time in my life where I walked up to a bulletin board and I pulled that strip of paper with the phone number and the contact information. Now we do it all online, but back then we did that. And I still have in my office at home, I still have the little scribbling I made of my first thoughts on it and making a phone call. And I called the church there and talked to Paul Spate. And he came down and he visited with me at the college one day. We had lunch, we hit it off. The church called me to come as their part-time youth worker. And that is where I started, just down the road in Ponoka. Once I graduated with my bachelor's degree, they brought me on full-time as an associate pastor. And we loved every single minute of our time in Ponoka. Both Sandra and I are from Edmonton, so it was close to home, and it seemed like a really nice fit, and we loved our time there. And all four of our kids they weren't all born there, they were all born in Edmonton. We'd go back for the doctor and whatnot, but they all spent at least their first year in Ponoka. We absolutely loved it. It was a place that we felt comfortable with. It was a place that we felt was home. After about 6 years there, or about 5 years there, I guess, Paul went on a sabbatical. And during his sabbatical, he invited me for those number of months to take the lead position and to preach every week. And I fell in love with being able to come and open up the Word of God, to look through the Scriptures and to try to figure out what God was saying to all of us. And I remember when Paul came back, and I went back into my role as the associate and the youth, and I still loved it, but I was feeling this call to another place. I was feeling this call to a full-time lead pastor position. And we received a call from a little town outside of Saskatoon called Asquith Baptist Church. I know there are some of you here that know where that is. Anybody else heard of Asquith? Few of you, yeah, good. My own kids stuck up their hand. You grew up there, I hope you knew. And we were there for 12 years. And again, we absolutely loved every single moment of it. That's a lie. There's struggles in ministry. There were moments, there were seasons where it was difficult, but we loved being there. We loved being in a small town community, and it was just, we were surrounded by farmland. Our back door out the church manse looked out on the farmland. And it was a beautiful location, it was a beautiful place, but the community is what made it for us. Our kids went there, and Ben, our oldest, was in grade 2. Nathan was starting kindergarten. And the other two, Rebecca was only 1, so Sam must have been 3. They grew up there. Ben graduated in Asquith, and we were there for 12 years, and we absolutely loved it. But we began to sense God's call to go somewhere else. And it's hard to put your finger on what that feels like. Because, like I said, we loved it there. There was nothing to push us out of there. There was nothing to lead us away. Our kids were established in their school. They had friends. They were teenagers. Let me tell you, that's the worst time in the world to move them, when they were teenagers. And we got a call after we dropped Ben off at Bible college for his first year. We were driving home, and I got an email, not a call, from a church just outside of Fort St. John in Charlie Lake, British Columbia, saying, hey, we got your name, and we're wondering if you'd consider coming up here and being our pastor. And I remember that we were experiencing the emotions of just dropping our oldest off at Bible college for his first year. We were in turmoil about that, thinking, oh, this is so sad. And then this gets plopped on our lap, and we couldn't get it out of our minds. Like, Lord, are you calling us to this? Is this something that you want of us? And Sandra and I prayed about it, and we talked about it, and we decided that we were going to set the bar really high. we decided we were going to go to our teenage kids and say, if every single one of you believe this is where God's leading, we will go. But if even one of you say, you know what, this is far outside of my comfort zone, I don't want to do this, we will honor that. We recognize the stage you're at in life. We recognize what is going on in your life and that you have these friends. And we talked to them, we sat them down, and every one of them said in a variety of forms, if God is calling you to this, we're not going to get in the way. Now, I wish I could say that was happily ever after. It was hard for our kids to move. And it was hard for them to leave their friends, to go to a different place, a different province, and kind of start over. Our son, our second oldest son, was in grade 11 at the time, and it was hard. And God was with us every step of that way. That was about 5.5 years ago. About 2 years ago, I began a second master's, this one in a master's of counseling through Briarcrest. And back when I started, it seemed like a long ways off, like it's going to be a long time before I'm done this, and it'll be nothing to worry about, nothing to think through. We're not going to have to move for a while. Well, because I had a master's already, they took almost half of my courses and plunked them onto this and said, you got credit for these courses. And suddenly, I went from like a 3 years to about 1.5 years where I could be completed. And so this fall, we are going to be, I'm going to be finishing up my Master of Counseling, thank you, and starting an internship in Edmonton for 8 months. And so we have had a whirlwind of the last few months. This wasn't something that was a given. This wasn't something that we knew for sure. It's an application process, and not everybody gets an internship when they first go. And I don't really have time to even go through that whole story. Although maybe I do, because you said it was an hour with Hebrews last week, right? So it can be 2 hours with Josh this week. So, but maybe I'll share more of that story at a later date. But we found ourselves suddenly within 3 months, 3 months ago, realizing, about 4 months ago, I guess, realizing that doors were opening, and it was a God thing, and I'm going to share that at a later date. And so 2 weeks ago, actually, we drove down from Fort St. John to Ponoka because Pastor Paul in Ponoka, it was his last Sunday there after 39 years. So we drove down to Ponoka, we got to celebrate with him, then we drove back up to Fort St. John. Last Sunday was our last Sunday at our church. And it was hard, and it was emotional, and it was difficult because, again, God had brought us into a group of people that we loved. God had brought into our lives friends and people that we cared deeply about. And so 2 weeks ago I was in Ponoka, last week up in Charlie Lake, and this week I find myself here. And I'm kind of looking forward to the next number of months being able to just come and be in the same place for a while. And we're excited about that. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we've come from and where we've been through. We've been in the CBWC for about 23 years, and we just have loved the family that we have here. And so, like I said, I'm going to share a little bit more about our family over the weeks. But I want to ask the question today of what do we do when God calls us? Because when I first felt the nudge to ministry, when I first felt and understood that God was calling me out of I was in hydraulics and worked in the hydraulics field. When we first was called out of that, I was frightened. I was scared. I was so uncertain. Like I said, I was more of an extreme introvert than an extrovert. I'm still the type of person on Sunday afternoons, I recharge with a nice afternoon nap generally because as much as I love people, they wear me out. I'm mystified by those people that can be in a large group and their batteries are being recharged. Like, this is great. And I think it's great too, but I get tired. And so I remember thinking, I'm not equipped to do this. The type of person I am, I'm not that type of person that can get up and talk in front of people, can meet with people for coffee, can counsel with people and care for people. I just don't think I can do it. And it's interesting because I've learned over the years that if God calls, it's our job to listen. When God calls us, He wants us to listen to that call. And I know that his timing was perfect, but I also know that I took 3 years to answer that call. And that's 3 years of ministry, 3 years of telling people about Jesus that I'm not going to get back. And what I've learned over the years is that God is not always going to choose the most obvious person when he chooses who he's going to call. He doesn't always call who we think is the most deserving, who we think is the most talented, who we think has the most biblical knowledge, who we think has a passion for people. But God gives us that passion when he calls us. And I think that extends beyond that need for us to be alone, for me to be alone. I went from thinking, how am I going to talk in front of people? It's exhausting, to thinking, what an honor, what a privilege it is. And even if I'm tired at the end of it, God has called me and I have to listen. And the fact is that he's been doing that all along. All the way through history, as we crack open our Bibles, right at the beginning in Genesis, all the way to the back end of the book of Revelation, God is calling people, equipping people, and it's almost never the type of person that you would think would fit the bill. And today I want to look a little bit at Exodus chapter 3. Because if there's somebody, and there's many people in the Bible, but if there's somebody in the Bible that was maybe ill-equipped in many ways to lead a nation, it was Moses. And so Exodus chapter 3, and I'll put the verses on the screen for you. I'm going to be reading from the NIV this morning. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that through the bush, that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. I love this because the first thing we see here is that God gets our attention. God will get your attention some way, somehow. Maybe it's subtly, like it was for me for years, and then it turns into a more smack across the back of the head, and where God gets our attention, where your wife says, why don't you listen to God? Because if you're not going to listen to him, don't keep telling me that he's calling you to do something. Don't keep telling me what you think that you should be doing if you're not going to listen. So the subtleness didn't work for me. It took that bluntness from Sandra to get my attention. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's a bit more obvious. Now, this passage of scripture here isn't subtle at all. It is an in-your-face call from God. I don't know, and I know there's been many fires in Alberta this year and in northern BC where we've been at. We see the effects of it. We see the haze in the sky, the smoke. But I've never walked up to a fire and seen that the bush wasn't burning, see that the logs weren't burning. That would get my attention. I would think there's something happening here. There's something unique here. There's something that I have to pay attention to. And Moses was wise enough to think, what is that? What is going on? Why isn't this burning? And then the bush makes a noise. Moses! Moses! The voice of God comes out of this bush. And Moses does what probably most of us would do. We just say, I'm here. Here I am. And he has no clue what he's witnessing. He has no clue what's about to transpire. And in verse 5 it goes on, do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. That's beautiful. Take off your sandals because the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then Moses hears these names. I'm the God of Abraham. I'm the God of Isaac. I'm the God of Jacob. And We don't know, because Moses grew up in the court of Pharaoh. We don't know if he's even heard these names before. We don't know how much of his history he actually knew at that point. But what we do see in this is that at the voice of God, Moses knew that he was standing in the presence of holiness. And it says he hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. You know, usually when we hide our faces, it's out of shame. We think of Adam and Eve in the garden where they're hiding from God. We think of times in your own life maybe where you've done something wrong, you've said something to hurt somebody, and when you see them across the room, maybe you just kind of turn and think, maybe they won't notice me, maybe they won't see me. We hide our face, and so often we use that idea of hiding our face because of shame. But Moses isn't ashamed at this moment. Rather, he recognizes God's greatness, and he's scared because he recognizes the fragility of that moment. He recognizes that his life is hanging by a thread. He recognizes that everything he maybe has believed up to that point maybe isn't true. Because now that he's standing face to face with the living God, his eyes are being opened. Which is interesting because he's hiding his face, he's hiding his eyes, and yet his eyes are being opened to who God is. And I wonder what we do in that situation. When I was younger, I always used to tell people, you know, if I were to see God face to face, I'd have so many questions, and I'd want to hear the answers of all these burning questions that I've had for so many years. But the reality is I think I would hide my face out of reverence, out of respect, out of fear, because I was standing in the presence of the Holy of Holies. When we see somebody we love, when we see somebody we respect, sometimes we're a bit dumbstruck, we're a bit fearful, we're a bit overwhelmed and overcome. Now I'm going to tell a story about these last couple of years, and I'm not trying to make myself sound really great and popular. It's about a little kid, so I can put it into perspective. But during the 2020, 2021, up in northern BC, we had great periods of time where we could not meet as a church at all. And so the only way that we could do church was through our live stream. And so every Thursday or Friday, I'd sit down in our fireside room or in my office, and we'd record the message, and we'd put it all together. And then when we were finally back at a stage where we could gather again and we could come together again, this grandma brought her little grandchild up, and I was talking to the grandma, and this little grandchild, he's probably 6 or 7 now, he kind of kept hiding behind his grandma, and she said, well, what's the matter? And granted, it had been a few years since he had seen me in person, and he kind of reached up to his grandma, and she leaned over and she goes, it's TV Josh. And I thought, it's TV Josh? And he what's he mean? She goes, you're the guy he watches on TV every Sunday morning, right? So I got all prideful. I'm like, yeah, I'm TV Josh. And I told my kids, you remember who I am. I'm TV Josh, right? But that is kind of, in a really, really roundabout way, what it would be like to meet somebody we care about, somebody that we are passionate about. And let me tell you, that mystique wore off after 2 Sundays. Then I was just the guy he'd bang into as he was running by, and he didn't care anymore about my past TV career. But we are often overcome. But I want to remind you, the other thing, that if God calls us, if God calls you, he has a plan for you and for others. Now, God may use you to impact the lives of others. And here's the thing, you might never get to hear about it. You may never hear the results of your obedience to the call of God on your life. Because he doesn't just call us just for our own benefit. He doesn't just call us just so we can feel good. He calls us into places, and he calls us into ministries and into relationships with people. It could be your neighbors, it could be your coworkers. He calls us into those moments so that others can hear about what he is doing. So others can hear about the saving grace of God, that he sent his son to die on the cross for everybody's sins. We may never hear the result of it, but because of your obedience, lives may be changed. Lives may be impacted because you said, "Here I am. Here I am, Lord. Do with me as you see fit." Moses was living in the desert. He was on the run. Most of you probably know the story. He killed an Egyptian soldier because that soldier was beating up on one of the Hebrews. And he killed that soldier and he ran into the desert, and he had been out there for years. Now, if you're looking for a candidate to lead your country to the promised land, Moses would not be on any list. He grew up in Pharaoh's court. He murdered somebody and ran into the desert. He's been wandering around in the desert as a shepherd. He's got married. He's started a family. He's comfortable. He was probably willing to live the rest of his days out there in that area. If you were to look at his resume, you probably wouldn't give him a second glance. But here's what I'm so thankful for, that God doesn't work the way that we do. God sees beyond our limitations. God sees beyond our past sins. God sees beyond all of that, and he says, here is how I can use you despite yourself. Here is what I can do in your life even though you don't think that you can do it. Here is what you can do when you listen to me. Verse 7 of Exodus 3 says, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." 20 minutes before, he's minding his own business, caring for his flocks, doing whatever he needed to do for that day. And now he's talking into this burning bush that's not really burning, and it's the voice of God, and the voice of God is saying, now go. He doesn't say, you know what, I want you to go and prepare. I want you to find a mentor. I want you to go to college. I want you to go and do some reading about this. He just says, now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. Now, if there is an overwhelming task, that is it. Getting up in front of a bunch of strangers, that's a bit overwhelming. But what was asked of Moses was extremely overwhelming. You want me to do what? You want me to lead a nation? You want me to lead 1 million plus people out of Egypt when they're not allowed to just go? You want me to go back to where I'm wanted? To where I murdered somebody? You want me just to freely walk back into that situation? You want me to speak to Pharaoh? You think that after all these years wandering around in this desert, tending the flocks, caring for my flocks, caring for my family, that I can just walk right back in and speak to the Pharaoh? And if it were you and I, many of us, we'd just say, no thanks. There's got to be someone else. And verse 11 kind of tells us, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And I think that's actually a really valid question. Who was Moses that he should go back to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who are you that you should go to your neighbor's house and begin a relationship with them and speak to them and tell them about God? Lead them to God. Who am I that I should come up in front of all of you who have met very few of you and tell you this is how you should act, this is what you should do, this is what the Word of God says? It's a valid question. And we've all thought it. We've all thought, you know what, we're not ready. We're not old enough. We're not well-spoken enough. We're not dynamic enough. And the list could go on and on. If you give us a reason to come up with excuses why we shouldn't answer the call of God sometimes, man, we can come up with lists just like that. And I know I'm not the only one. I know that we've all been there and done that. And I've thought almost all of these things during my life. But I've also learned that the moment I begin to think that way, God often has me right in the place that He wants me, dependent on Him. Because you see, we can't follow the will of God. We can't heed the call of God if we're not dependent on God. There's a reason we come to church on Sunday mornings. There's a reason we gather together in Bible studies. There's a reason we pray for one another. There's a reason we lift one another up. Because we're dependent on God. And here's the best part when He calls. If God calls you, He's going to equip you. If God calls you, He's not going to say, go and do that and have a good time, figure it out. He's not going to do that. Verse 12, the first half of verse 12 says, and God said, I will be with you. And God said, I will be with you. I want you to think about that for a second. I will be with you. Hebrews 10:23 says, let us hold on swervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful. Now, I'll be honest, I have let a lot of people down over the years. Likewise, a lot of people have let me down over the years. That's just what it means to be human. That's just what it means to have a sinful nature. We sin, we mess up, we do things, we say things to people that we regret. But there's one constant that's never changed. God is with me. It doesn't matter if it's something that I look back and think, that went well, that was like a success. It doesn't matter if I look back and think, that couldn't have gone worse. That was one of my biggest failures. God was with me. He's with us in every success. He's with us in every failure. And He's with you guys in every uncertainty. And Moses didn't know all of this during this first encounter with the living God, but he was about to experience that truth for the rest of his life. And I wonder this morning if some of us have been fighting against God's call. And I truly don't know. I don't have any special insight or insider information. Scott didn't hand me a list of people that say, pray specifically for these. I have no clue, but my guess is that there are those here that have maybe been fighting God's call in their lives. And my guess would be that there's some here that are just not listening, like I was way back as a young guy. I didn't even want to hear the plan He had for me. I had my own plans. It's amazing when you're in your early 20s, you think this is what's going to happen and this is how it's all going to play out. Almost nothing that Sandra and I planned in our first year of marriage has come true. And yet neither of us would change a single bit of what has happened in our lives, the good and the bad, the failures, the successes.